What if I told you that Squid Game wasn't just a show? That South Korea actually had a place where people were taken off the streets, locked up, tortured, and forced to work like slaves. This isn't fiction, it really happened, and the place was called Brothers Home. Welcome to You Be the Judge, where I break down real cases and you decide what's justice and what's madness. Now, today we're going back to 1980s South Korea, a time when the military dictatorship was obsessed with order, control, and image. The government decided to clean up the streets, but instead of solving poverty, they treated people like trash. And that meant that homeless people, street kids, and sex workers, and even mentally ill people or people that looked dirty were picked up, thrown into trucks, and sent into so-called rehabilitation centers. But these weren't hospitals, they were prisons, labor camps, torture zones, and the worst of them all, Brothers Home, located in Busan, run by a man who claimed to be a religious leader, funded and protected by the government. Now, behind those gates, over 3,000 people, including children as young as 9, this is where the Squid Game comparison starts to feel real. People were snatched off the streets, taken to a secret location, and forced to play a for survival game they never agreed to. Now the difference, there was no prize money at the end, just trauma or death. Now inside Brothers Home, victims were forced to work all day, all night, making clothes, furnitures, and more. Now, this wasn't rehabilitation, it was business. And if you resist, you are tortured, sometimes in front of a crowd, as warning. Others were beaten unconscious, locked into coffin-sized boxes, or never seen again. I'm telling you, this is reminding me of Squid Game. Now, here's what a few survivors said later. They treated us like dogs. No, even worse than dogs. I was 14 and I was locked in a cage for 2 weeks just for crying. I still hear the screams in my sleep. And now the cruel irony is most of them committed no crimes at all. One journalist later wrote that it was the perfect crime. The public looked away and the government paid for it and the victims were silenced. And let's be honest, this sounds like a game rigged from the start. So what happened when the truth came out? In the late 1980s, after South Korea's dictatorship started to collapse, journalists and human rights activists started to expose Brothers Home, but the justice system wasn't ready. The facility director was sentenced to just 2.5 years of prison, and that wasn't even for abuse or murder. It was for embezzlement, money laundering. Can you imagine that? Think about that deeply. Over a dozen documented deaths, hundreds of abused cases, children locked away for years, and the main guy walked away almost free. Now let's pause here. I want you to think about what justice actually means, because sometimes the courts don't get it right. Sometimes survivors are left with pain while perpetrators move on like nothing happened. And now if this sounds familiar, it's because these things still happen, just in different clothes, different governments, and different names. So now it's your turn. Was Brothers Home a product of its time or a state-sponsored nightmare that was deliberately hidden from the world? Should the South Korean government do more today? Not just to acknowledge it, but to actually compensate the survivors who are still alive and going through this trauma? Drop your verdict in the comments. Was it justice or was it covered up cruelty? Would you have survived a place like that? And if you thought Squid Game was intense, this case shows that sometimes real life is the real horror show. Like, share, and subscribe, because in the next episode, we'll be tackling another exciting case and you won't want to miss it. This is You Be the Judge. See you again. Bye.